This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft, because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story.
Hey, Storyworks writers, if you're enjoying the podcast, we would love it if you could head over to wherever you get your podcasts and leave us an awesome review.
Welcome to part 2 of my conversation with author Talia Carner. We discuss her new novel, The Third Daughter, just released by HarperCollins this month, and we pick up the conversation where we left off last week, talking about the relevance of this historical novel to today's society, as well as writing strong female protagonists, even when they're in circumstances that are quite disempowering. Now, you conducted extensive research, it sounds like, and then freed yourself to tell the story and move into your imagination. And this is a historical work, but I'm curious what relevance you think this has for today's readers and for today's world. You've told us how you're very concerned with women's issues and freedom from violence, economic freedom and such. So why choose a historical version of this story instead of contemporary? And is that maybe more effective at reaching today's readers using the historical context?
I wrote this story because I heard in my head that cry of the Filipina, and that cry turned into this keening of those women, victims of Tzvi Migdal, who were forgotten, whose story was never fully told, even though, as I'm saying, there's a lot of documentation about it, but not from their point of view, not from what it feels like to be one of them. So that was something I needed to tell. The relevance for today is that, unfortunately, 120 years later, the methods have not changed. Traffickers travel and advertise in the Southeast Asia and Eastern Europe with false promises of jobs. They no longer try to convince the parents about marriage that is imminent, even though that happens a lot too. But definitely the method of luring women with false promises has not changed one bit. Also, what has not changed is the balance in the marketplace. You have the supply. You have the suppliers and you have the demand. On the supply side, and this is the economist in me who looks at this picture, on the supply side, you're going to have almost an inexhaustible supply as long as there's misery and poverty and war and strife in all kind of places around the globe. And America is the promise, the likes of which you cannot even begin to measure against the other. So the supply is inexhaustible. The procurers will continue as long as the profits are enormous and as long as the risks are relatively low to what they stand to benefit, which means that as a society, we are not punishing them enough. The demand side is the men who buy sexual services. And needless to say, it's by far greater men who do that. And the victims are mostly women, but you have also boys and men and transgender. It's much smaller percentage, but definitely it exists. But this demand side is the most vulnerable to exposure because no one wants to lose his job over the fact that he used the boss's computer to buy sex, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or they don't want their name plastered over the local newspaper as being arrested. But as a society, whom have we been punished every time there was an arrest?
The women.
The victims.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
The victims. Instead of the ones who are the perpetrators. And the perpetrators of sex acts are the men.
Mm-hmm.
And they are vulnerable to exposure. So it's actually the weakest link in that economic paradigm. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So what we need to do, and this is what we can do today that we could not have done 120 years ago. We have 21st century sensibilities
Mm-hmm.
where we now understand that the prostitutes are victims. The Swedish paradigm for that is one that takes it to even more extreme. And since they consider all of the prostitutes victims, they consider all the men rapists.
Okay.
And the crime is therefore rape. Because these women, regardless of how they dress and what they say and how they solicit, the idea is that they are victims. Mm-hmm. And these men should know better. And this is now gets into education. Because once it's presented this way to men, and it's not easy. I'm encountering now, as I get interviewed by men also, that I have to be careful as how to present, because it's all around us. It doesn't take place in planet Mars.
Mm-hmm.
It's taking place all around us. So there are ways to educate, and once we start educating, I'll give you an example.
Okay.
In the United States, 2/3 of sex trafficking is from abroad, but 1/3 are U.S. born. And this is sex trafficking. This is not including labor trafficking, which is a different story. I can't handle all misery at one time. So in the United States, of U.S. born prostitutes, guess what's the entry age?
I have no idea, actually.
It's 12 to 14.
Wow.
Which means they are children, because until the age of 18, the law says there's no consent to being trafficked or to sell sex with the revenues going to a third party. So under 18, that's considered trafficking, whether the teenager has given consent or not. It's not they are not allowed to give consent, basically. But that means that it's been done 12 to 14. It's at school.
Right.
It's on the internet. And who are those children who are being targeted? They tend to be already in families in crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the family has the parents are already drug addicted. And they traffic their own children. It's not unheard of.
Right.
Maybe there's an illness in a family. A parent is very ill, or there's a sibling who's very ill. It draws the attention of the family, and the family tends to then ignore the good kid who doesn't need attention. He or she managed well.
Right.
It's the child, the student in the school who is socially isolated, and needless to say, that is an extremely painful situation. So when you get a 14-year-old who is isolated, she's not popular, and others, whatever, pick on her, whatever the reasons, and all of a sudden she has an older boyfriend, and she feels so good about it. And he showers her with gifts, and he takes her out places. And then one day he may say to her, I lost the card game last night. would you just do me a favor and have sex with my friend and help me, I rely on you, you are my, and anyway, your brother has been raping you for so long, so what difference does it make if you do it for me out of love? And so on. So then he videos her, and he said the next day, he says, if you don't do it again, I'm going to spread this video. And she's now becomes a sex slave. We see that all the time. There are programs that there's an organization called protectnow.org that it's unfortunately only based out of California, and they are moving into Nevada and other states. But the program is a fabulous program starting with 10-year-olds, fourth grade. It educates the school boards, the parents, the teachers, the students' government, and they teach them how to look for signs. Let's say a girl like the one I described to you, that all of a sudden she has a fancy iPhone.
Right.
Where would she get it? And how to approach it the protocol to approach it in a non-judgmental way, even if it's other students who are now getting involved, how they are being taught how to use this through a protocol. And that program is amazing. It goes on every year. They keep on upgrading the program as the children grow up and mature and begin to understand. So it's age appropriate. There's a lot to be taught in that area.
Now, you wrote a protagonist who we can see a lot in the story of what you were just describing in our contemporary world. And one thing I've heard is that from agents is that they want active, strong female protagonists who are going to make women feel empowered, and also that they don't want to see any stories of rape. And so, you know, when you've got a character who's 14 or younger, and she falls into circumstances like this, such as kidnapping and slavery, it is difficult to have an empowered, active protagonist in that kind of situation. And yet, these are some of our most compelling stories about women's journeys. So I'm wondering, first, if you encountered any roadblocks to telling this story, either in your own conceptualizing of it or when it was time to take the book to agents and publishers. And second, can you just talk about writing an empowered female protagonist, especially one who starts in such a place of tragic disempowerment?
Okay, there were quite a few different stories here, but questions. But I will start with saying that as you were talking, I said, "Oh my God, I'm so glad that I didn't have to go through this hurdle," because at the beginning of my writing career, I heard so many objections and so many formats and so inconsistent objections that eventually, luckily, I managed to get over the hurdles and get published again and again. But this time about not having rape, I can see why. Luckily, I am with HarperCollins. I have one editor who trusts me and I trust her. And I was going to write about it. I just Googled to her Tzvi Migdal. And she wrote back, stupendous. One word.
Nice.
That's it. That's all I needed. Now, our relationships are such that once I throw an idea and she says, go ahead, I spend as many years as I need to, and we don't talk about it. And she doesn't see it until I have a final manuscript that's been edited to death, that I've myself have read it 40 to 80 times. I'm not exaggerating, by the way. And I had my writing group, and I had a professional editor, copy editor going through what we used to say, dot the I's and cross the T's.
Yes.
Type of thing. The equivalent of that. But once she got the book, so I didn't know whether once she saw it, whether she was going to throw it against the wall or buy it. I'm not under my contract with HarperCollins is that they have the first option, but I don't want to have a contract to write something specific or with a specific date, so that I'm free. I write what I want to write, whatever catches my fancy, and that there were chances that she may have turned it down.
Right.
But obviously she loved it and she bought it. And then she did her editing, and her editing was to cut what amounted to 50 pages.
Okay.
Not in one chunk, but by removing paragraphs, sometimes scenes, and at the end she removed 2 full chapters. Book was going on, So it came when I finally sent her the manuscript. After that, it was 50 pages shorter than the one she had first seen. But I would say that the majority of her editing is of this nature. But before then, we're talking about rape. This was necessary. And I must say that I had written in a very early drafts, there were a lot of worse scenes. And I knew I had to write it because it was part of me getting into what was happening.
Right.
Knowing that I would then have to mellow it down and cut it. And that's what I did. But it's interesting when you say the publishers, a strong protagonist, no rape. This was inevitable. And probably there are going to be people who are readers who love my writing, who have followed me before, and who find this to be too difficult. On the other hand, I will get new readers who will say, oh my God, this is so strong and emotional, and they can't put it down. So
right.
I then they go back to my other. Now, as far as
oh no, I was just going to ask if you struggled with finding the balance point between depicting how horrible this abuse was and, tipping that scale to where readers would be repelled by it and turn away, and, needing to really honor the truth of what happened to these women, but at the same time being sensitive to readers' ability to handle anything too graphic.
Yes, I all throughout the book, in every scene, I had to deal with that. How much to be true to what happened, but how to reduce it to a bite size. Also, there is the emotional arc. Stephen King is very good at it. Create the tension, but then lower it just a bit before you move up again. And you ratchet it, and then you little bit down, and then you ratchet it up again. So she becomes a tango dancer. And I use the tango as a new way for her to express herself. I used it for moments of hilarity, as were moments within the brothels, the friendships among the women, sometimes the bickering among the women. But those are moments of relaxation. They kind of make it normal. The times that she goes to the market, the times that she goes to the theater. There are other parts of her life that are meant to cut and lower this tension. But at the same time, her life became so good that I had to remind the reader that, oh, you know what? She has to sit at the window right now and tried to seduce men in the street to come up. So that was a struggle all throughout.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and did you struggle with, you obviously can't write a book about a prostitute without dealing with sexuality, and at the beginning when Batya enters Freda's brothel, she's embarrassed to see the women there, partially undressed, makeup on, men around. This world is so foreign to her, but she necessarily becomes a part of this world, and that becomes her own life. And she even learns to appreciate her body and to sometimes, with certain clients, enjoy her sexuality. So was it, how did you think about this character arc in terms of keeping her likable and relatable to your readers, who, most of whom, let's hope, have never experienced such degradation, while also, again, being true to that situation she was in?
Yeah, she starts the novel more or less starts when she's 14, and she's very naive. She has absolutely no knowledge of what sex is, and that's why you asked me to read something. I prepared one of the short chapters, but very typical as to her view about what happens between a man and a woman. And that is the morning after she was raped by Moskowitz. He had just taken her out of her parents' home. She had always dreamed of having a bath. Just taking a warm bath, and she just got a bath, and she thought she's living the dreams, and she's in the lice had been cleaned out of her hair, and she got to eat very well for the first time in her life, to get the meal like this, because starvation was very much part of her life in Eastern Europe during the pogrom and the poverty that the Jews lived under.
Right.
And now and she had been raped by him in the middle of the night. And here's an example of how I had to deal with her emotions, because she's dirty, but all of her family's hopes are on her that she would take them out of Russia. And now this man who took her to be married, now he was not going to want her because she's impure, even though he's the one who caused it. But she really doesn't want to get married yet, and promised not to marry her for 2 more years, not to rape her the first night. But she doesn't even know how to handle the relationship with him. And with her family and what she wants at this point. She's so devastated. She never imagine that this is what happens between a man and a woman.
Right.
So you want me to read that?
Yes, please. Why don't we hear some of the story?
This is the beginning of chapter 9. And the next morning they are on the train continuing their journey to a port city, which she doesn't even know what city that's going to be.
So this is Batya and Moskowitz, the man who has just promised to marry her.
Again, I had to deal with what kind of emotions she could show, but not to tire the reader, because, if you have a girlfriend who she keeps on complaining about the same thing, you get tired.
Right.
So, it's a matter of balance. On the train, Batya laid curled on a seat in the private compartment. Just yesterday, she would have felt awed to travel by train, let alone ensconced in the luxury of leather-upholstered seats and curtained windows. Now she didn't care. "Sit up," Moskowitz said. Batya shook her head. "Look," he said quietly. Nothing about his voice was menacing. Nothing in his tone indicated the brutality he had displayed during the night. You know all about marital life, don't you? She shook her head again. The seat beneath her cheek felt sticky, uncleaned, used, like her. He sighed. Your mother should have instructed you. It's in the Bible, the way a man and a wife are. It says, he would cleave unto her. Don't quote the Bible to me, she wanted to scream. That was her father's domain, and her father would never do such a, quote, cleaving to her mother. Don't tell me that God decreed such filth. As if it were happening now, she felt Moskowitz's naked body crushing hers, her private parts violated, his lips sucking her neck. She had seen dogs copulating, and once, when a neighbor brought a bull to impregnate his cow, heard the trumpeting sounds of the beast, even though her mother kept her inside until it was over. But dogs and cattle were animals. Humans had been created in God's image and were therefore above such acts. It was implausible that her mother had conceived so many times in this disgraceful way. The sudden screeching of the axles beneath Batya was accompanied by a yanking of the train car, followed by a slow, shuddering jerk. Batya sat up, wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand, and fixed her gaze outside as the train began to move out of the huge station with its palatial glass-domed roof as high as a mountain. She placed a palm on the window pane as if to hold on to the receding station before being carried away, alone at the mercy of these horrible men. So this is just a scene. It's of course continued, but you can see the tension, and then I lower it by talking about the trains beginning, but then it has to reflect her emotions. What does she feel about this train moving and about the station? When she sees this enormous station, she puts her hand like as if on the window, as if to hold on to that station as it carries her away for the rest of her life. And it will follow in this short chapter that when he says to her something about a man and a wife, she realizes that he still wants her as his wife, which means she'll have to do all of these things with him, but then she'll have a chance still to save her family.
Yes.
So she already in that first dilemma of what to do, how can she not accept?
Right. That was great. Thank you so much for reading that to us, Talia. I would love to continue this conversation and get into some of the themes of the book, but I know Robert and Catherine are about ready to join us. So, listeners, make sure you go to storyworkspodcast.com to find links to Talia Carner's website, as well as her book, and come back next week for more of this conversation with Talia, me, Robert, and Catherine at the Roundtable. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.